morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us. You know, they say cloud computing, or the cloud in general, is a great leveler. It's a great democratizer of our globe as we know it. Think about it. The mere fact that I, right now, am sitting or standing and coming to you live from the town of Ajax, the beautiful St. Francis Centre here in Ontario, Canada, and at this very moment, I'm able to beam in folks from all across Africa to join this session, gives you a sense of the level playing field that the cloud has created. Now, of course, a lot of people and a lot of theorists discuss the cloud from multiple perspectives, looking at it from an infrastructure standpoint, looking at it from an access standpoint. Is it truly a great leveler, or is it further dividing us on socioeconomic grounds, depending on who can afford access to the cloud? Over a period of time, cloud access has got relatively more better, relatively more accessible, and the skill sets to work on the cloud have become widespread. But the question that we always have, especially when you're at a security conference of security leaders, is how secure is the cloud? I don't think it's necessarily an option for most CISOs, in that their businesses are moving from on-prem solutions either to hybrid or to purely cloud infrastructures. But how does the CISO today, in light of the shifts that we've had over the last 8 months, understand and approach the cloud? Many times in my classes, I've always said to my students, it's never really a cloud per se, it's always somebody else's computer. And I've always been a proponent of the fact that don't trust a computer that you simply cannot throw out of the window. So join me today as we get into a discussion with leaders from across Africa on how they approach cloud. My name is Abbas Hirji. I work at Durham College. I lead both the AI Hub and the Center for Cybersecurity Innovation. And I'll tell you one thing. If we're not able to take some risk, we're truly not able to understand how far we can go. But how do we measure risk in the cloud, and how do we make sure that we are adhering to security principles? Join me as we travel all the way to Africa to get some perspective. I'm going to begin with Vikas. Vikas, could you introduce yourself? Where are you joining in from? And can you define for us, in a very quick introduction, what does cloud mean to you? Vikas?
Hi, Ali. Thanks a lot. I'm the partner in charge in the PwC practice in Mauritius and the cyber leader for Africa. I've been doing this work from the last 15 years, managing the client risk, and we have seen an evolving landscape of around how the cloud has come over and disrupting the business model. So for me, it's like you rightly mentioned. Is it something nice to have or must to have? I will certainly say it's a move that we all need to go along as the trends are moving toward a transition to the cloud services.
Thank you so much for that, Vikas. And I think that word that you used there is extremely important, the word of disruption. You know, there's disruption, but there's an ability to control that disruption, and how much does the cloud change and transform the way in which we do businesses. One of the things that I want our audience to pay attention to is, especially we have a lot of folks who are joining us even from North America at this hour, is the context within which cloud works and how different communities approach the cloud. It's not quite the same. I've always retained this. There's never a one-size-fits-all solution when you are working and deploying solutions on the cloud. And I really want to get into those details of how the cloud in Africa has disrupted not just the way we do business, but the way in which consumers consume services, be it from the private sector or also from their governments as well, with a lot of movements around e-government. So thank you, Vikas, for that fantastic introduction. And now we're going to shift over to Samuel. Samuel, very quickly, your title, the company that you work for, and can you give us one example of how the cloud intrigues and interests you? Samuel?
All right, thank you very much. My name is Samuel. I'm currently the Chief Information Officer of Tangerine Life Insurance in Nigeria. I've had over 15 years experience in cybersecurity protection, information security, covering the different areas of information security, security engineering, security operations center, and the like. So for me, right, like you said, cloud is disruptive. It's either you go in there or you stay where you are and you don't get to enjoy the benefits. So being disruptive, and is also a major evolution in the information technology space, because most systems before now, we've had a lot of disruption in terms of service availability and quality. So the cloud has been able to address that issue, because I remember days where we used to have email on-premise using Exchange. We've had a lot of issues supporting and managing that. But moving to the cloud, the likes of Azure Office 365, the service availability and quality has been fantastic. So cloud for me is evolutionary, for me is disruptive, and it's something that everyone needs to consider. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I've said this before as well. It's so important to look at not just how the cloud has disrupted the way in which we deliver services or consume services, but also the way in which we budget for our services. One of the questions that I know will come up is this aspect on, once the IT infrastructure has moved to the cloud, has it freed up more budget from a security perspective? Has it allowed us some flexibility in terms of deploying more solutions to secure the way in which we deliver our services? And I've said this a lot of times, that a lot of folks who know the price of everything and the value of nothing. I want to know not just the price of the security implications of cloud, but the value of securing the cloud as well, especially when we think about how citizens consume services, especially from a government perspective. Samuel, Vikas, those were wonderful introductions, but I cannot move forward without welcoming Gilbert again. He's been joining all of the sessions. He's been trooping through. He's in no need of an introduction, but all I wanted to tell him is, Gilbert, I believe you're joining in from Nairobi, but I do know that you've got a lot of background in Kenya as well. So asante sana for all the help that you've put together for making this conference happen. Gilbert, from your perspective, why is the cloud important to Africa? And then we'll jump into our discussion. Gilbert?
Thanks, Ali. Of course, I'm joining in from Istanbul, Turkey. But as you say, I think that's already a definition of the cloud that you already introduced, me being in Kenya, but I'm in Turkey. So I think that tells us what cloud is. To me, cloud means agility. It means ease of doing, ease of information sharing. Access to services, the way Samuel has put it. So cloud, to me, I will just put it, digital transformation, agility, and ease of doing, or other ease of, service accessibility. And, that's it. I'll put it at that.
Fantastic. So Gilbert, thank you for that, and thank you for correcting me as well. Key word there is around access, but another one there that Gilbert's mentioned is the understanding of agility. Because what agility does when we think about cloud infrastructure is that it basically, in its definition, it suggests that we're able to scale and increase our capacities based on the demand. A very different understanding of supply and demand comes to the equation when we start thinking about cloud. And that is a very good point in which we have to ask, how does security factor into this? As you're watching this on cyberexchange.ca, you'll see there's a little data set, like a ticker that's on the bottom or the footer of the screen that's showing you a bunch of data points. One of the data points there says roughly about 62% of security personnel who are seeing their infrastructure being deployed on the cloud, are seeing their businesses, are seeing their services running entirely on the cloud, have very limited visibility into what's happening in that cloud. You cannot measure you cannot define what you cannot measure. You cannot explain what you cannot measure, or so they say. And I want to start off with Vikas and ask him, for a CISO today, how important is it to have tools where you can monitor how your cloud is being consumed, not just from a high level, but at the very micro level as well? Vikas, let's start with you.
So Ali, I think it's a good point, and I think personally on my personal experience around acting as a virtual CISO for quite a lot of corporate, and what I've noticed that there's a move in the ask from the board and the executives to really move their core on-premise environment to move on the cloud, but at the same time, there are key areas to look into. When you're building your organizations to move on the cloud, how secure that cloud migration is going to be? Are you fit for cloud? That's the first question that you need to look at. The spinning up of the infrastructures on the cloud is quite easy, but at the same time, you are exposing your environment to go outside core boundaries. So what is required is in terms of, have you done a proper assessment around, is your legacy environment is really fit for moving onto the cloud? That's the first aspect of looking at it. Next to it is basically like, if you talked about the cloud, whether it's Amazon or whether it's Azure or whether it's Google Cloud, how are you making sure that you have a security that are being ingrained when you're moving your infrastructures or the platform onto those clouds? So obviously there's a point of like what you see the differences. There's one side where the maturity is quite ahead of the game, and on one side where the legacy of the platform. So there's a mismatch, and you need to really bridge that gap.
Yeah.
And you need to embed some sort of a security, and you need to take that risk-taking attitude to say, if I need to move, maybe my legacy applications are not as secure, but if I'm moving into the cloud, I need to really take into consideration secure by design principles. And that's very key relevant in terms of that. Why? Because the board and the management will keep on asking you to modernize your digital footprints, and at the same time, the data exfiltrations is going to happen much more wider. And in that case, if you don't assess what are your crown jewels, where this information are hold on, it become a bit challenging. So what my role has been in terms of the last 2 years, especially when there's a lot of move and this post-crisis, organizations are really moving toward a shift toward the cloud. What sort of decision making are being done, and why are we moving to the cloud? That's a very important aspect. Is it because the provisioning become quite easy, pay-as-you-go service model? Or are we ingraining or putting the security also embedding as part of those transitions? So firstly, on a personal account, like what I've been having the conversation with clients around it is, let's embed the security across the value chain. So what does it mean? Like, if you are moving the cloud, what sort of governance and how do you manage those risks is a very key aspect of it. What sort of auditing, what sort of assurance you are having around that there are controls embedded and you can monitor those controls. Moving up to the value chains around, people are going to access this information sitting any part of the world. How do you manage and ensure that the identity and access are really being, first of all, rightly classified, and then obviously monitored on a continuous basis? We are seeing more and more regulations becoming more stringent around the data privacy. You need to also be very comfortable to say where your data resides and what sort of data protection mechanism that is in place to ensure that your cloud infrastructure is secure for any data leakage. And a couple of other areas to look around the infrastructure security, your hardening around it. How are you making sure your development security operations to really become resilient enough? How are you making sure in terms of your threat and vulnerability management programs are good enough to really do a continuous assessment of your cloud services? Yep. You cannot just live with the model of like you transfer the risk to a cloud solution partners and it just mitigate all your inherent risk. You need to have that sort of resilience to really build some sort of continuous logging, monitoring mechanism in place to have some resilience around that environment. So looking at those, which we call it like a cloud security reference model, is something that the client should look at on their end. And together with what we've seen from Amazon or AWS, they are coming with a well-architected framework. They are taking part of their part of the services provisioning. But you, as a client, as an institutions, they need to also build and ingrain the security in whatever transition they are planning to do.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key aspects that you brought up here is obviously the proactive versus reactive stance, but it's also that, yes, when we look at certain cloud products that are out there, they do come, for example, some cloud, for example, in Canada, when we look at certain servers and we look to deploy in them, we do see them to be compliant as per them, to certain standards like the healthcare standards, so on and so forth. But it's very important to understand the data that you're going to be putting within those cloud environments. And you mentioned a couple of things around the perimeters around cloud, including identity access management. And I want to come back to that a little later on, because I've seen already one question come up around access to our clouds, root access versus general user access across the internet. And I want to come back to that a little later on. Samuel, I want to come to you now, because I've always said this, that if you don't know where you're going, all the roads will take you there. In your books, from a security perspective, when your team comes to you and says, we want to move certain architecture into the cloud, what are some of the questions that you ask them about why they've chosen to move to that cloud environment? Can you shed some light on that and perhaps give us a security angle on that as well? Samuel?
Right, thank you very much for that. I would respond to that, aligning with what Vikas has said. Truth be told, the cloud is going to stay, right? The digital transformation strategy of most organizations requires that you build a borderless technology, a borderless network. You build a modern workplace where there is so much collaborations and all of that. And if you must establish that digital footprint, cloud is priority option. Now, however, going to the cloud, you need to, as a cybersecurity professional, have a cloud strategy. And I think that's the first point of call, right? So your strategy will speak to the set of applications, systems that are cloud ready, the applications that you really want to deploy to the cloud. So when you've done that homework, right, you are starting to ensure that you cover all the loose ends. And I'll give a typical example, right? It is not all applications that are cloud ready, right? So you need to be sure that your systems are, cloud ready, and those cybersecurity capabilities that you have on premise, they are also available in the cloud. Most times people think when you go to the cloud, you deploy your systems there, they are secured by default. They aren't, right? The level of effort that you've put in deploying security controls for on-premise system, you also need to think in that light for systems that are deployed in the cloud. When you have things like network access control deployed for on-premise system, and you have encryption, across communicating channel for your branch network, and you're going to the cloud, you need to also put all of that into consideration. I tell people when you go to cloud and you expand on your digital footprint, you are also expanding on your threats, your threat landscape is expanding, right? Just take a typical example where you have 5 branch locations that are connected to your data center. But now you want to enable remote work, borderless technology. That means that you now have the number of branches equivalent to the number of your staff that will be connecting to your workload that you've deployed in the cloud. So all those security capabilities that you've deployed for on-premise system, you need to start thinking about how to deploy them to those systems as they move to the cloud. And that's where I say a lot, right? With cloud, it means there are no more perimeters, right? So your security needs to now go more to the endpoints, right? So you need to beef up your endpoint security and ensure you have visibility across board, right? Identify the blind spots, ensure that you have visibility across the entire, layers of the ISO standard from layer 1 up to layer 7, and you have those visibility. And if that visibility is clear and is paramount and is well nurtured, you have a very good and a robust security system such that you have a single point of truth where you have visibility across the entire system, both for cloud deployed systems and also systems that are deployed on-premise. And I know that most of the cloud service providers, they have some of these capabilities. And I'll give a typical example. For Microsoft Azure, right, they've got Sentinel, right? Sentinel gives you visibility, like building a SOC capability and visibility for your cloud-enabled workloads. So all of that needs to be put in place, and you ensure in contracting with a cloud provider, you have taken care of all of that, right? You have your detailed checklist and you check your boxes, to be sure that all those capabilities, functionalities, they are all deployed as you move your systems to the cloud. Thank you.
Absolutely, and I think you've emphasized this point so beautifully. So don't just tell me what you're going to be doing on the cloud once. Show me what you're doing. Show me at all times, at any point of time. You've emphasized the point of transparency as it applies to the cloud. And I want to come to this because both Vikas and yourselves have gone through this path of the importance of transparency, but there's a certain skill set which also comes with understanding how to monitor, how to gather data, how to understand what's happening on the cloud in order to extract intelligence from it, in order to be proactive with it. And I want to come to that skill set very, very shortly and work through that architecture a little bit more, especially when we start thinking about an application that has a web server and then the core infrastructure itself and how we can draw intelligence from it. We'll take a pause on that, but I want to come to Gilbert for a moment because we have quite a few folks who have also joined in from North America. And I've always retained this is that when it comes to the cloud, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. And I said this at the beginning as well. Gilbert, can you shed a little bit of light on the context around cloud in Africa? Who are the main providers? Are you seeing more providers that are locally spinning up their own environments, or are you seeing more influence from the AWSs and the Googles of the world? Can you provide a little bit of context around the adoption of cloud in Africa today?
Thanks, Mari, and thanks to Samuel and Vikas. Just to add on that conversation, allow the fact, what Samuel added before I just respond to your question. Samuel talked about, Samuel and Vikas, they talked about a very, very critical element, the strategy, the cloud strategy. Are you ready for the cloud? Because I think the mistake most organizations are making, we are seeing, most organizations making, is that, yes, they just jump into going to the cloud. But have you done the right risk assessment? Ensure that at least you've done your risk assessment with regard to your environment. Do you understand what exactly the applications you need in the cloud? If you're in the banking, for example, you're not going to start shifting your core banking system to the cloud without understanding exactly, what exactly is going to be the impact. So I think I love the fact that Samuel and Vikas have made it very clear. Ensure you have a cloud strategy. That's the number one. And I think, I can't emphasize more on that, because if you don't have it, then you might get it wrong. And I think that's where most organizations end up getting it wrong. Yes, they're jumping into the wave. No doubt, cloud is an amazing stuff and amazing technology. I mean, can you imagine an infrastructure like, for example, Uber, for example? The entire infrastructure of Uber runs on the cloud. I mean, look at that, what it has done, what it has transformed. You're everywhere in the world, or you're able to access the Uber infrastructure. I mean, if it was the cloud, I don't think they could have been able to scale it to that level. So we see the advantage that cloud has brought to us. But to bring on your question that you have asked me, what are we seeing in Africa, for example? In the beginning, we were talking about the question of data localization. I think I bring that question now down to data localization. We are seeing a lot of interest and a lot of data laws as well that are being passed in Africa with regard to data localization, where countries are requiring some of this data to be within, the territory. Well, there's a lot of argument that, if we don't allow flow of data, maybe, are we allowing also our data to flow? But there's an issue of also the integrity, and also there's a lot of also an issue of business intelligence, and we have to accept, because you can imagine I'm a bank, for example, and my data is flowing. I have to be able to know what exactly is the level of accessibility of this data in another territory. So this is a huge concern with regards to the angle of how do we ensure that this data, which territory is it being accessed and where is it? For sure, we understand that, for example, maybe in Africa, for example, there might be an issue of maybe to say, fine, it's good to have this data center in Canada or data center in Europe because of, maybe power side, whatever the issue is. The infrastructure, no doubt, is quite developed in most of the advanced world. But I think the conversation is now changing, where we are seeing, for example, the likes of AWS. I think a few months ago, they were now building their nodes. Yeah. I think I remember one of their teams were in Nairobi. They are now realizing this conversation they have to be part of, because these continents of these countries are going to, laws are coming in that at least are going to require some sense of data localization. It's a conversation that is going to be there. And more so, for what I foresee, is in the financial sector, where the financial sector, the regulators are going to at least impose some regulation with regards to data transfer, which is not bad, because countries also need to have also a sense of data protection and data, with regards to the citizens. Because you can imagine your entire infrastructure and banking or rather financial infrastructure being in another territory. Yep. Well, you need to understand how exactly that data is being assessed, because otherwise also there's angle of national security, if you may. So those are angles I think we are going to see. But no doubt, for example, if you look, and that brings back to the angle of technology in Africa. Africa has been a consumer of technology. I think this is the conversation we are starting to have, that Africa, or rather developing countries, do not just have to be consumers of technology. We have seen, for example, if you go to most of the organizations, they are Windows-based environment. I've been in penetration testing assessments where most banks, whether we like it or not, is a Windows-based environment. That's a fact. And when it is that, for sure, you're going to expect who are the dominant players are going to provide to benefit from such a situation. I have no doubt almost 80 or 70%, I don't have the exact figures to not quote what I don't know, but at least you will find these are the dominant players, because these environments are already running some of these infrastructures, and it becomes very easy for you if your environment is Windows-based. I mean, who will you go with? Without even without even asking questions. Okay, we are going to use Microsoft Azure, for example. It will be it will be quite you don't need, it's a no-brainer. Already you're having more of application, because cloud infrastructure is application-based. So you're talking about applications, you're talking about the Microsoft 365 and the rest. So you will realize that most of this environment, I have no doubt, I haven't done research on it, but I think Microsoft must be at the front line, the big players. Yep. You will have the AWS for sure. Now they're establishing their nodes. Of course, you have the guys, what's the name? The Googles as well. Yeah, but you are also now seeing China as well. I mean, don't forget, now we are talking about the G Mafia. There's an interesting book called the G Mafia, the G Mafia, the 9 companies that are going to control the world in the next decade. You're looking at these countries are the ones that are going to, have access to this data. You're talking about the big boys like Alibaba, for example. I'm seeing now Alibaba Cloud is also trying to come into Africa, because this is a huge market. You're talking about a population of 1.5 billion, and the population keeps on increasing. By 2050, we're looking at 2.5 billion. And you can imagine now we are talking about the data, the population is increasing. It's going to be a very, very interesting market. So to me, what I see, Africa is going to be a next frontier for the cloud, cloud providers, because there's a lot of interest in this space. There's a lot of information flow, so it's going to be very, very of interest to them. But unfortunately, is that you realize some of these major players are the ones who are quite fully well settled, more so in the continent. So I think it also calls upon the government, African government, to be able to also think that we need also to be able to empower, or rather be able to also think more on a structural way of thinking, that can we, because we have the resources, we have the team, we have the skills to be able to do it, can we be able to even make advanced, or rather good deployment, or rather investment in some of this infrastructure? We are talking about fiber optic cables flowing across Africa now, with good African companies doing that. Can we be able to empower and have some of good African companies that are able to compete in the same space, so that we just don't fully depend on this technology, or rather companies that are the major dominant players? Thank you.
Absolutely, Gilbert. I think you've raised such an important point over here, which is on the aspect of sovereignty and data. I've said this a lot of times that, I work in AI as well, and we say that if AI is the rocket, then data is the fuel, because data allows you to see today what might happen tomorrow. And that predictability within data is really the oil that's going to fuel a lot of future developments. But I think you've raised another very important point, rather 2 important points. Number one is, when we look at Africa right now and the talent pool within Africa itself, you look at the different code academies that have been set up. You look at the various cloud academies that have been set up within Africa itself. You look at the university curriculum as well, or you look at the diaspora that's growing in Africa as well, of folks from different countries who are now coming in with talent around managing and deploying cloud. And that also impacts the consumption of cloud. Of course, for our audience, it's also important to realize how ubiquitous connectivity has become, including 5G connectivity. You look at the cost of phones coming down as well, and how that employs more access and reach to the cloud. So these are all important contextual matters. I always emphasize this, that cloud doesn't operate in a vacuum. There's context around that. And I want to thank you, Gilbert, for setting that context. Vikas, I want to come back to you here, and I want to go back to this question on the talent pool that is required. When it comes to cloud computing, we often say cloud computing is not about where you do computing, it's about how you do it. Are you seeing that it's becoming a bit, and this is a question that's come in as well, and I'll reword it just a bit. Are you seeing that it's become a little bit of a challenge from a talent perspective? And what do I mean by that? Typically, cloud architects will focus on, hey, I've got the web server correctly tuned up. I've got the Tomcat, Apache, whatever I need over there. The web server is correctly tuned up. I've got it speaking to the AWS environment as an example where you've hosted your application and a bunch of APIs. Security, that's somebody else's concern. Are you seeing that it's a little challenging now to have those talents that you need to look for security and adjust for security within the cloud architect firms that we're working with, or the people that we're working with that are deploying in the cloud? Vikas, your perspective.
Yeah, Ali, I think you spot on the right questions from a technology standpoint. Players like Google, Amazon, and AWS, if you look at, and in terms of the Azure itself, they have a fantastic footprints around how they have modulated their whole architecture. Now, what we look at around, if you look at the organizations today, they are sitting on a very legacy environment, first of all, and like those legacy environments are sitting on the flat architecture. Yeah. If you look at some of the organizations, you'll be surprised to see there's not enough zoning of the network itself. So what happens in terms of that? Do we have an adequate understanding around how do we just classify different tiers of our applications to really provide some sort of layer defense on that? When we talk in terms of talent behind it, I think the talent today is the security architect, or in terms of your network architect, is one of the key things that are being taken up in the curriculum today. And what I go back to what Gilbert and Samuel just mentioned and resonate to your previous questions, where if you look in light of those players, the Amazon or in terms of the Microsoft, they are opening their hubs in Africa. Now, opening their hubs in Africa means twofold. Firstly, they believe that there's a market in those places where data sovereignty is required, that the data should be localized in Africa itself. Secondly, they also believe in the talent pooling, where talent needs to be upskilled in terms of new architecture learning, understanding a new way of modulating your environment to spin it off onto the cloud environment. So with that in mind, a lot of curriculums that have been imposed around it. I go back from a point of PwC itself. If I look at from a point of PwC itself, the cloud has been something taken as a very enriching from the last couple of years. And there's a lot of academy around the cloud academies, those CyberA and all those academies are providing a lot of the digital platforms, trainings in terms of that. And those platform trainings are quite a good of a way of learning, self-learning on the digital platforms to understand how to build a cloud infrastructure. That's very important. How do you deploy your workloads in the cloud? How do you architectures to build that layer of defense and give confidence to the business also? So very important aspect where the business typically want, if you look at the current crisis where the business is really looking up, let's go onto the cloud. That's because our workforce are not going to be sitting in the four boundaries or four walls. The application has to be scalable. At the same time, it should be easy accessible. Now, when those questions are put in frame, your team sitting at the back who have been very conventional way of doing the business has to really challenge themselves and reframe the business model to say, how are we going to just upstream that particular environment in a way which give me scalability, availability of this information. At the same time, I have a confidence in this informations are not going to be accessible outside these organizations.
Fair enough.
So very important aspect. Training, learning curve is something that has already been started in Africa. A lot of people are enrolling themselves. I have seen a very good uptake in terms of universities bringing up this curriculum, like you mentioned earlier. And it's important because we need to move with the trends. We need to move in terms of not teaching the old schools chapters, but in terms of like what is really relevant in today's environment. And if you look at more of those agility of deployment of those applications are becoming quite aggressive in terms of agility around how quickly you can deploy an application, how quickly you can have your development operations in terms of moving up in a more faster and agile manner. So with this in mind, the university are also changing their curriculum to make the youngsters who are coming up and to be abreast of those technology in the different platforms.
Absolutely. And I think this aspect, that little word that you use at the end, youngsters, and how they're learning about the cloud and what trainings they're getting, because this will come up a little later on. But I want to talk about a little bit about security trainings in Africa and how early those start. So I'll come to that a little bit later on. But I do want to pick up on another point that you brought out, and that was the agility and hybrid nature of the cloud. And Samuel, if I can, I'm going to come to you about this, because one of the things that we often talk about is while we want to empower our teams, I've said this before, CISOs don't necessarily put the no in innovation. They want to empower you, but they want to reduce risk. You don't go into cloud being risky. You try and bring down the level of risk when you are deploying on the cloud. In your perspective, from a CISO's eyes, how much agility is required to ensure that if something's going wrong in the cloud, we can shift to an alternative on-prem solution? What kind of controls do you have in place to bring back, or do you recommend organizations have in place if their cloud is compromised to go back to another state? Your perspective on some best practices.
Right, thank you very much for that. Before I answer that question, I would like to speak a little on what Gilbert and Vikas said. Sure. About building the cloud capabilities in Africa. And I will tell you that there are a couple of cloud providers already spinning up in Africa, and they are doing excellently well. I strongly believe that if the underlying technology is right, you have the underlying technology and it works perfectly, you can build on it as long as you have the skill set to manage it, right? So for instance, there are a lot of data protection laws in Africa, in Nigeria, for instance, where there is some laws that speaks to data residency, data localization. There are some data that you cannot put anywhere outside the local country, right? So in doing that, most of these guys are coming up and they are building the cloud platform to cover the different cloud computing technologies, ranging from infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and they have all of that done perfectly well. Because the other advantage you get is on latency, right? Latency, that's the speed of accessing, those systems that are local in country. Because when you have those systems deployed outside Africa, you fall the chance of having a lot of latency issues due to round tripping and all of that. So the market is here, the opportunities are there, absolutely. And I know there are startups that are trying to take advantage of that, and if they do, I'm sure we'll come off better in Africa. Now, speaking to the question you asked, right, on ensuring you have a system that is resilient enough, such that when you have issues for workloads that have been deployed to the cloud, you are able to run the business. So what I advise is to start with having a robust business continuity management strategy and a very effective disaster recovery plan, right? So for me, I strongly believe that as much as you're deploying those workloads in the cloud, you should also have like a unique, environment, on premise, right? You can back up your systems, right, locally, or on your backup service that sits on premise, and you do a lot of disaster recovery simulation exercise, because that's what gives the level of assurance. Should there be any form of disruption or systems that are deployed in the cloud, you can still run the business leveraging on the disaster recovery environment and have been deployed and adequately tested. So for me, I think it's all encompassing, right? I tell C-level executive in the cybersecurity space that cybersecurity professionals, we are business enablers, right? We must be able to provide the relevant platform for business to run. We are not running a cybersecurity shop. Rather, we are enabling business to be able to achieve their objective and goals. So in doing that, business continuity, disaster recovery, effective backup plans must be adequately put in place. Not just put it in place, ensure that they are adequately tested so that the level of assurance that the board and the executive needs to be sure that business can run, should there be any form of disruption, should be provided. So that's how I will answer that. Thank you.
Very good. And I think what you've brought up there is that important element of the CISO, which is, you have a plan A, but I want to see a plan B and a plan C and a plan D. There are many other alphabets that need to be followed as well in order to ensure that if you're going to the cloud environment, that you've got some control in that moment of a disaster. And I do want to unpack a little bit about what are the different disasters that specifically in Africa that have you thinking, not just from an ethical, let's say a hacking perspective, but there are other areas as well that we need to be thinking about that are specific to certain geographies. And I want to come back to that a little bit later on. Gilbert, there is a question that's come in, and it kind of ties into what Vikas said earlier on. and this was on the aspect of security by design. You've heard me say this a couple of times, is that you don't build businesses, you don't build successful empires, you build people. You invest in people, and people build these businesses and these processes for you. People, process, technology, and in that order. Gilbert, is there any efforts through the Africa Cyber Defense Forum to support trainings around, especially cloud, but more importantly, around secure DevOps? Because it's mostly our developers now who are deploying applications in cloud environments. Are you doing anything to empower developers in Africa with more secure practices, especially around secure DevOps? Gilbert?
No, thanks, Ali, for the question. So yeah, we've done a lot of because remember I also have two caps. So I also run a cybersecurity consultancy firm that has operations across Africa, where we've done a lot of. I've done a lot of training for government, for a lot of. Can you hear me?
You're okay.
1 minute.
We'll give Gilbert a second or two to get his audio back in check.
My headphones. Yeah, you can hear me?
Absolutely, yeah. Gilbert, carry on.
Thank you. So yeah. So I was saying, around the other cap that I have as well of cybersecurity, information security consultancy firm that I run as well, that has been offering a lot of training across Africa. Doing a lot of penetration testing, vulnerability assessment as well, and we do a lot of training on that. And when it comes to cloud training or rather cloud security, now we are moving away. Now you hear conversations like DevSecOps, SecOps. Now we are operation. Is no longer just the normal development. Security by design is very, very important. So that's where we are having even, let's say, developers, for example. Are they developing applications that are secure, and also being able to be deployed to the cloud in a way that are secure? So we are having trainings on security, secure software development, and ensure that these softwares that are being developed are agile and are able to offer the business value that is required. So there's a lot of training as well we have on that, but we're also launching a different program that and as a champion of an African driven knowledge, I will be reaching out to the likes of Samuel and Vikas, and to me, with all due respect to the different training providers in the Western world, to me, I want Africa Cyber Defense Forum to say, look, we received a training from Africa Cyber Defense Forum that gives us the capabilities that we need. You don't have to pay, for example, the $7,000, $8,000. At least you can be able to pay quite a moderate amount, and it's trained by African African professionals. With all due respect, of course, we can always call upon other professionals as well from other outside world. But I believe that Africa needs to have its capabilities of training, because we've done all the different trainings, whatever the SANS, whatever. We have all the certifications, but you can't tell me of a real African certification. So we have to also be able to train our people with regard to the reality of our environments, because also you have to look at, for example, what is the cost of training of some of these training. They're quite expensive. Some of our people cannot be able to afford them. So we have to be able to customize some of those results. What we have done at Africa Cyber Defense Forum, where we have a team of cybersecurity professionals that write custom courses, to be able to respond to them. And I think I've seen a lot of good uptake of those courses, because they respond to the reality. They are vendor agnostic, but they can even use, for example, in IDS, you can even use open source tools to be able to train on IDS, for example, SNOT, whatever. So those are a type of training that we are championing at Africa Cyber Defense Forum, that are in reality with the ground and the reality of our challenges.
Gilbert, thank you for that. And for the audience that's listening, if you're following the stream on cyberexchange.ca, especially during the breaks, you'll see little links where you can actually go to the Africa Cyber Defense Forum and get more details. And if you are on cyberexchange.ca, well, you are if you're watching this session, you can connect directly with Gilbert and other folks from the Africa Cyber Defense Forum by going on to cyberexchange.ca and friending them as members. And I invite you to take advantage of those opportunities. We've got about 30 more minutes, and I want to come to a couple of other questions that have come in, and I'll weave them in different ways so that we can probably try and tackle 2 questions at a time and get in as much as possible. And Vikas, I'll come back to you, and we'll continue in the order that we are. You know, I've always been a firm believer of this, is that not only should you know who you're doing business with, you should be doing business with people who are in the know. Whether it's you're looking at Azure or AWS, there are a lot of third-party vendors that assist with deployment, that deploy these infrastructures for you. As a CISO, specifically within Africa itself, what are some best practices when managing your vendors that are providing you cloud solutions? Vikas?
Yeah, I think it's quite an interesting question, Ali, you touch in, and I think it's very key questions in today's time because, see, when you look at the threat landscape today, it has been evolving in terms of those things like we mentioned, and I heard from Gilbert and Samuel earlier, and you touched very rightly at the start. The role of the CISOs is certainly have also shifted up from value protections to now to the value creation. So that's a very key aspect of it. So what we are saying, yes, we want to move on with the third parties who are managing those solutions on our behalf and our server rooms, or you can say your data centers is no more a data centers. It's basically a connectivity zone to those cloud engines. But what we have seen is like that you need to be very rigorous in terms of which solution partners you want to go for. I always put one question to my clients. You know, the vendor landscape is evolving. So you can see almost all the vendors are coming with the different solution to the same problem. So it's the same problem, but a different solution set. And how do you make sure which is the right choice of technologies or which cloud service provider you should move on? So what we call it, and I think it's very important aspect, the third-party risk management play a very key aspect of that. And in this case, we are talking about third-party security, third-party cloud service providers, we call it. So what are the key elements that we typically need to do in a sanity check around it to say that, okay, if I'm going with a cloud solution partner, what I should be looking at? So let's look at this. We classify from a point of what sort of the IT security infrastructure good practices this organization just follow. We cannot just rely on in terms of that. We might be doing some point quite well. Let's talk, for example, I've seen an occasion where banks have very good protocol around the internal security policies, the practices. Now, as this transition non-critical asset on the cloud, and there's a cloud service provider, and they don't have adequate controls around how do they manage the access systems, how do they secure those networks, then it's another weakest link in your whole value chain. The second layer of looking at is in terms of the HR side of things, and we must be surprised what human resource has to do with the cloud solution partner. I think it's a very key aspect around how the governance are being done in line to this service providers in terms of how do they manage their own policies, what sort of regulations under which they act on. Are they just an integrators to provide those services, or do they have a sound framework based on some good practices around it? We move to the value chain from there to look at a couple of other areas in terms of doing the due diligence sort of things to say, what sort of financial stability, very important aspect. What sort of cash in power and how much they're borrowing it. Their financial statement looks a good order, or if these companies which I'm just hosting my services might not be there anymore. Going forward to that is in terms of like a couple of other key elements that have been under discussion, and some of our clients are asking about it. What sort of CSR, which is the corporate social responsibility around it? Are we also taking in terms of the sustainability of the environment around it? Okay, we can just switch off our power from our organizations and moving to some other organizations. But what sort of sustainability practice that they are building up, or they have some sort of ethical practices around to manage their workforce, because cloud service are running around the clock. And apart from that, a couple of other areas to look in terms of the service providers to say what sort of resiliency they have built on themselves. How are they in compliance to the legal and the regulatory protocols? Have they gone to those things? If I'm going for a different region of like my availability zone is sitting somewhere in the Central Europe, and I'm just looking up in the other part of Australia, I need to see what sort of things that they have done on their side to provision. Now, what we are seeing out here, like Gilbert just mentioned earlier, there's a lot of integrators. Samuel also mentioned there are a lot of small players and boutiques which are coming up to really become as a cloud solution partners. It's good to know that they are a cloud solution partner, but we also need to do a proper due diligence around it. That are we okay to do the business with them? Obviously, the backbone is sitting on AWS or Azure, but they're also going to not take a liability of how this transition from your on-premises to cloud take on. Of this answers.
Absolutely, and I think this aspect of liability is one that I want to use to catapult back into Samuel, because you've raised a couple of very interesting points around that. I think that aspect of corporate social responsibility in the cloud is very, very crucial, because it tells you a little bit about the ethic on the ethics of which organizations you're doing business with. Often, if you are on the developer side or you are on the business side, you tend to look at the financial, the ROI on something and how much is it going to cost me, and the cheaper the solution, sometimes you move with it. But these other elements that you've asked us to think about really goes back to what I said earlier on around cloud never operates in a vacuum. There is context around it, and you've got to look at the track records of certain applications, certain companies, and how they've performed in order to understand whether that is the right fit for you. We will come back to that equation a little bit later on, and I want to go to Samuel right now because the questions come up on the aspect of auditing. And if you recall earlier at the start of the session, I spoke about the aspect around, has cloud, because of the lack of having a lot of on-premise solutions, has it freed up more budget to do other security practices around our cloud deployments? And a question has come in around audits. Audits are an extremely important practice for any CISO. It doesn't just show you what you're doing, it shows you what you're not doing. Can you comment a little bit about the frequency of audits? Has it increased, Samuel, as companies now scale across the cloud? What's changed about audits and compliance checks now that you've been moving a lot towards the cloud? Samuel?
All right, thank you very much for that question. Before I jump into that, I would just want to speak a little more on what Vikas said. Bordering around third-party engagement, especially with adoption of cloud. I'd like to say that beyond performing risk assessment of the vendor, right, or the third party, and also engaging them to understand their capabilities, there is a little area that I see most organizations don't do, right? And I think that should be at the core of third-party management, and that is around monitoring, right? Monitoring, and I'll give typical examples, right? You may have a very robust contractual agreement with the vendor. You signed your SLEs, the guys have been agreed, and all of that is, and you know, giving them the right privilege, right? And they are on your system, you realize that they are abusing the privilege. So monitoring is very, very key, right? As long as you dot your I's, you cross your T's on contracting, you need to have full visibility on what they are doing. And I'll give a typical example of the experience I had with a particular vendor, right? We done everything with contracting, and we gave them the required privilege. And we realized that they were abusing it, right? And they were using the access, you know, to access malicious websites unknowingly, because the representative vendor that was working didn't know that we have that visibility on exactly what they were doing with that privilege. So it's important that you have that monitoring, you know, adequately in place. As you give them access, you ensure least privilege, only give them access to exactly what they need, and you also monitor so that they don't abuse the privilege. The other area of experience that I had was a particular vendor that came on board. You know, we had to give him access on the network admission control system, and he plugged in his laptop right into the environment, and he was running a password cracker right in the environment. You know, not knowing that the SOC had visibility on everything that is happening on the network, right? And that was picked up. So for me, beyond performing risk assessment, contracting with the vendor, and doing all of that, you need to have full visibility on exactly what they're doing and the activities they are performing. Now, going back to your question on auditing, the frequency, if it's very crucial and required, I will start by saying auditing is very, very important, right? And if you look at the security defense in-depth ideology, where you layer your security, one of the things you have to do is to have a third layer of defense, and that's where audit comes on board. So there must be an external party, right, that is auditing your system against the security controls that have been implemented by the cybersecurity folks, right? So we need to be able to ascertain the effectiveness of the controls that have been implemented, right? Because it's one thing to deploy a security control, it's another thing for it to be very effective. So those are the things that audits will pick up, right? To be sure that the controls implemented are implemented adequately to the level that they ought to be implemented. Because most times you see that the maturity level of the implementation of those controls are very low. Whereas these controls have been budgeted for, they've been paid for, but they are implemented not to full maturity and full capacity. So it's important that the audit regularly comes on board to do that. So in terms of frequency, my approach to it, they are in two folds. One is you have ad hoc reviews. Ad hoc reviews, for me, after you've implemented the controls, the audit should come on board, right, to check how effective that control has been implemented. The other thing is you can have frequency of audits, which could happen possibly every quarter, right, where you check all the systems that have been deployed, across the entire ecosystem. Because as changes are happening, it's also possible that the security experts or the security professional would have downplayed some of these controls and capability. So it's important that the audit is regularly done, right, and all of that. Thank you.
Absolutely, and I think this aspect of the audit is always done and is done ad hoc as well as during set time periods, points to a very important element. The subject of this panel is the modern CISO's approach to the cloud. And I think you very subtly brought over this point about communication. I think it's important for those who are listening, whether you are at an executive position or you're starting off or you're a developer and you're developing in the cloud and you've been audited for your practice on the cloud, the idea is not to be punitive. The idea is not to punish you for a practice that may have caused an issue, but to educate and teach you. Cloud is evolving on a daily basis. I've said this before many times, the clock resets at every day. Every day presents new challenges and new opportunities. And the CISO, the modern CISO, if you will, is now really focused on communication. How do you communicate the results of that audit? And the way in which it's been presented to you really shows you that you need to take into account the level of that staffer who's deploying on the cloud. You need to look at certain other elements as well, contextual realities around who's doing what in the cloud and how best to empower them and educate them through those audits. So thank you so much about emphasizing that role of the audits and its importance in that. We've got another 15 to 18 minutes left, and I want to come back to Gilbert because he's been a very seminal aspect of this conversation, and I want to talk a little bit about the vulnerability piece and the assessments of the cloud. Always I talk about this aspect of while you're driving your business forward and you know where you're going, pay attention to your blind spots. Can you talk to us a little bit about what's changed, or how has vulnerability assessment and pen testing changed because of large-scale deployments on the cloud? Gilbert, your perspective.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks, Samuel and Vikas, for the wonderful contribution. It's interesting what is happening today. I mean, having spent a good number of time on different, exercises on penetration testing and, IR and the rest, we are seeing a new perspective on assessment, for example. And just to look back on that, is that most organizations did not see, and unfortunately, most in Africa is a very bad culture. They only see assessment when they are hit. And when there's an incident is when they think of, can we do something? While in reality, assessment should be a continuous, you're looking at the PDCA cycle, it should be a continuous process. And that's how information security management should be, is that you should even, with regards to, you should have maybe your, vulnerability assessment policy, how frequently it should be done. And, we noticed that most organizations had not really taken this very, very seriously till there's an incident. And, if you have been in IR, for example, incident response, when somebody calls you at 2 a.m. That they have been hit, and the vulnerabilities are, a known vulnerability that could have been fixed, then, you know what it means. And I always say, IR is a young person's game. I mean, it's quite grilling. You wake somebody calling you at 2 a.m. And I remember an incident where one bank was, a compromise, of course, no mention of name, and it was a very simple vulnerability. They had access to the entire core banking system, and they were demanding Bitcoin. But after the IR process, we realized it was a very, very simple vulnerability. But because of the lapse, that this organization we were looking, they have never even done a penetration testing. They've never done any assessment. So I think there should be a change first and foremost on the angle of thinking, understanding, the vulnerability assessment should not just be done for you to have a report to present to the regulator. It should be a continuous process. You can just run simple even Nmap scan, for example, on your network, and you get a report. Is an open source tool, for example, OpenVerse, for example. Before you have a third party review to give you, a full report, you should be able to do it continuously. But to bring the angle now, where we're in the cloud, the assessment has changed. Even to penetration testing teams, it has now changed, because now you are assessing a cloud infrastructure. So even the angle of assessment has to change, because when you are doing assessment of penetration testing on premise, it's not the same infrastructure when you are assessing the cloud. It's totally different, because the cloud you're talking about access is application-based type of environment. So in there, even the penetration testers, from what we're seeing, is that they have also to be able to expand their knowledge and horizon to be able to understand the cloud infrastructure now. If you have a pen tester who doesn't understand cloud infrastructure, then it might be a penetration tester who needs to go back to learn his skills, because the environment has changed. We are seeing now applications, becoming different. So that angle of assessment has changed totally. That angle of the vulnerability penetration, even the tools are becoming more and more advanced, and I think also even from the service providers themselves, they are also now developing these capabilities to be able to do also some assessment and maybe provide the clients with the different reports. So I think we are seeing now where people are realizing that, we cannot just now take the angle of vulnerability assessment as something, we just wait and do maybe the end of the year when the regulator needs it, but it should be a continuous and an ongoing process.
Absolutely. And I think another key word, there are lots of keywords that have come out of this discussion, but besides communication, continuousness, and the continuous nature, continuous improvement, continuous integration of how we do such tests also takes me to another C, which is the cost. And I do want our audience to pay attention to the fact that these vulnerability assessments, especially as they move from on-prem to cloud and are more application-based, unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to look at it, each application comes with its separate set of costs. And when you're budgeting, one of the elements that the CISO has to take into account is the number of application and instances that you're running all add up to additional costs when it comes to your assessments. So how you time your assessments, how you budget for your assessments is so fundamental. And it goes back to the earlier point that Samuel brought up, which is on the aspect of communication. And the modern CISO, and I'm sure all of you would agree with this, is one that is not only in tune with what the team's doing, but also in tune with the financial realities of the business and the CFO's environment as well. And these are communicated ahead of time, proactive as opposed to reactive. We've got another 10 more minutes, and I want to breeze through a couple of more questions as quickly as we can. And again, I'll maintain the same order because it seems to be rolling well. And Vikas, will come back to you. And Vikas, this is the question on identity, which both you and Samuel brought up earlier on. That traditional perimeter of the firewall, we all know, has changed, has shifted, but so too has our understanding of identity. When often we talk about cloud, one of the things I do with my students is I retain the root access and only I give them access as and when required. But it's not quite the same in large DevOps teams, especially if more and more people are required to work in the cloud infrastructure and the cloud deployment. How do you manage identity and security around identity in the cloud? Is it just about, yes, this person is so-and-so and has put in the right password? Or is it more about how do you watch and manage what each person is doing in that instance of the cloud? And how do you react when something is not quite right? Vikas?
I think, Ali, you spot on the right questions. If you look at identity and access management, has been always be a key concern. If you look at all sort of impersonations privilege escalations that happens, and where you don't need to wait for an attacker to come and hit your parameters. They are going to use your credentials somehow or others to steal identity theft that happen. And using those credentials, they try to escalate their privilege and have a lateral movement in your network. So what we have seen from the point of what is the, quite an interesting discussion happening, the organization are facing two challenges. Firstly, the employees have become a new parameter for organization to secure, because they are no more working in those organizations parameters. They have gone outside. They have an information access sitting from anywhere. So how do you manage who is accessing what sitting from outside the parameters? Right. That's first. Second thing, if we move on to the cloud, another parameters comes like, how do you make sure that digital identity in terms of you manage your Active Directory users, or you're deploying in terms of those group policies, they are managed in a way, in a consistent manner. So very important aspect. So what we have typically been advising, and I think this is very critical. Certainly, if you look at from a point of, if you look at the in light of the current crisis, where remote working was something exposed, and all identity need to have an access to all applications, because people cannot just sit in the boundaries. Now, as a CIOs and as IT heads, they have allowed those access to those applications. So what they are not realizing around also, if you imagine an endpoints which have a malware installed on it, and somehow there is an identity theft on that, how they use this particular access point to really compromise your entire network landscape. So that's one of the things. At the same point, I think one of the other aspects of looking at is where it's very important to have a continuous monitoring around those identities. So we classify in terms of privilege access management. You touch around that root access, you manage it, and the rest of the things people just manage. So there are privilege accounts which we need to be very thoughtful around. If somebody is just trying to escalate those privileges to reach to those access points, then obviously you have the entire network at your doorstep. So what you require is some sort of a solutions around the digital identity solutions are there. There are privilege access management solutions are there. Those are first and foremost important. To really secure your password, the root password in bold-based password, so that anytime, even the system administrator or somebody who have a root access, they cannot just access it without really passing up to that layer defense. And continuous monitoring obviously is something that you need to identify based on your critical business assets. Which are those assets where you need to require some of those use cases to run on to have continuous regular monitoring. So at least when you see some abnormal pattern behaviors in terms of those transactions, manipulations, you have a flag to raise and you can immediately respond to that particular incident. So I think it's a very critical subject that you touch around. Identity and access management plays a very critical role, if whether you are on premises or you're deploying your application on the cloud.
Thank you for that, Vikas. And Vikas, I will add one more important point here is that to the audience that's watching, if you're on cyberexchange.ca, which you are, and if you go up to the on-demand, you'll notice that there's a section called Power Hour, which is a show that I host. And I held a session with a couple of folks, including Janet Sai, Kat Kood, Bill Harmer, where we talk a lot about this aspect of identity access management. Forget the fact that the perimeter is dead. Forget the fact that we're talking about different forms of authentication. Just how we think about tracking and monitoring usage and the role of artificial intelligence in that. I will come back to that later on, but I do want our audience to pay attention to that. We have other sessions that are also hosted by CrowdStrike, by VMware, Carbon Black, SentinelOne, so on and so forth. Pay attention to how different tools are out there that do that kind of monitoring and have different alerts and calls that can preemptively tell you if something is an anomaly. Very, very interesting ways of understanding not just identity as authentication, but identity in terms of how you are working in a particular environment. We've got about 7 to 8 more minutes to go, and I want to come back to Samuel and then go to Gilbert. And Samuel, this question has more to do with the aspect of how, in your opinion, have insider threats shaped our perspective around cloud? And as a CISO, where are you, from a cloud perspective, where are you focusing your energies when it comes to understanding whether insider threats are real within your environment, especially if you're working in the cloud? Samuel?
Thank you very much for that question, and I really appreciate that perspective. It goes a long way to show the value that is derived from this session. Insider threats, there is really nothing much to overemphasize on it, because The insider threat has proven to be a major threat when you talk about cybersecurity threats. And the reason being that the insider is already in your environment, he has access, he understands your environment, he's familiar with everything that happens, right, in the environment. So that threat is huge, right? And if you look at the cybersecurity ecosystem, looking at the people, process, and technology, we are all aware that the people side is always the weakest link, right? And you're strong as your weak links. And if you look at how attacks are being launched, right, you start with the social engineering, right? And in social engineering, what exactly are these guys looking out for? They're trying to take advantage of the people who already are inside that have access to the system. So they send phishing emails, try to get access to, their accounts, and from there they escalate the privilege, and they are able to perpetrate their malicious intent. So the insider threat is huge, it's crucial, it's critical, right? So what I advise is to build a very resilient and robust security operations center where you have full visibility on what the insiders are doing. Your administrators, what exactly are they doing, right? And again, if you want to grant privileges, you can also layer your privileges, right? You create time-bound privileges to the administrators. For instance, you need domain admin privilege to perform a task. It's only given for a time period, and after that, the password, the account expires, right? So we need to build a dynamic system, right? Where we ensure that passwords, right, are not available for too long, right? When you use them, you don't have to use them again. So for you to use them again, it means a new password has to be created. So leveraging on OTP technologies, one-time password, developing strategies around multi-factor authentication, right? That will go a long way, right, in protecting the organization, even though you can have conniver within members, of your staff. And I'll give a typical scenario of an experience that we had sometime. In one of the organizations, we built maker checker, right, capabilities, such that no one person starts and finishes, a process, right? And we thought that secure enough, and we went to sleep and we said, with that, we are secure, we are good. Can you imagine that these guys, they connived and they defrauded the organization, right? So that's where the power of visibility comes into play. Security has to be defense in depth, right? When you have deployed a particular control, you need to start thinking of how can those controls, how can they be compromised? The insiders are weak. They are human beings, right? 98% or over 90% of the cyber fraud that happens, they start with the insider, right? Yeah. So we need to really, really understand that, right? So the insider rules, protection have to be intact, and it has to be adequately implemented. So monitoring should be at the heart of it. Thank you.
That is a brilliant way to put it. And I think one of the key aspects that you've brought up there is not the reality of insider threats, but the motivations behind all of these, right? And it's important that the CISO pays attention to not just, as I mentioned earlier on, the financial realities, but also the HR realities on the ground, the socio-political realities on the ground as well, knowing what's going on. And again, it comes back to context. We've got a couple of more minutes and two important questions. I'm going to start off with Gilbert, and Gilbert, that'll be your closing, and then two quick comments from Vikas and Samuel, and then we'll come to a soft landing before we go into a bit of a break, and then we go into the post-lunch session. And Gilbert, this question is targeted directly at you. Here in North America, we practice a lot of principles around BYOD, bring your own device, bring your own application that you want to use, your cell phone, your laptop, whatever have you. In your perspective, should a CISO be open to folks bringing in their own devices to use some of our cloud applications, or should all devices be corporately sanctioned? Gilbert, a quick comment from you on that.
Thank you so much. And I was enjoying the conversation. Just before I respond to you, I mean, what Samuel was saying, insider threat is one of the hardest threats it's a pain on any CISO. I mean, this person already has access, in the network. If they call you, this is even hell. They have access. I mean, these are users in the AD. I mean, what, I don't know. This is a person. He's a big threat, and it's a big challenge. Really big challenge. And touching on that, what you just asked. Now there's the concept, and I think this, as I close on what you've just asked me, is that to tie on to your question, you've seen, of course, the vendors have jumped into this time. I always, vendors love to jump into buzzwords to sell. The so-called zero trust. Every vendor, I think, is selling zero trust, and every guy, zero trust. Well, so. It's an interesting conversation because everybody now sells zero trust, but it ties down to what Samuel and Vikas was talking about, the things like, identity access management, the two-factor authentication, the OTP, where I think the cloud environment, whether us moving to the cloud, has now changed. Even, now it's no longer about the perimeter security, and you're seeing that even moving now to the endpoint, where the endpoint is becoming a very important angle in the cloud architecture and the cloud security, where we have to, there's no trust. You can't trust anything. And coming to your question as well, to tie onto that, you're talking about BY, bring your own devices. Now, you realize, for example, and this is a conversation most CISOs face, is that, for example, you have your CIO or CISO is traveling to Dubai, and he has his MacBook, and this MacBook is connected in a hotel in Dubai, and he wants to come back, and he wants to connect. It's like, why am I not having access on my laptop, or rather my MacBook, to the to the entire network of the organization? Now, when you put the different controls, maybe the CEO is not able to access, the corporate network is not able to send his emails. Yet this laptop he went to Dubai was already compromised. Somebody already installed a rootkit, or rather a rat in the laptop, and when he plugs into the network, already the guy has access to the entire network. You can imagine such a scenario. This is the same BYOD you're talking about, where people are bringing their own machines as well, and it even becomes very hard to manage it when it is the angle of maybe top management would not understand the risk that maybe this might expose. When the controls that have been put in place, some of them feel that it is, mostly in the banking, maybe it's like, okay, why are you limiting me from accessing, the corporate network? I want to send my email, without knowing that the attack vector, some can even just originate from the email alone, So when we put in this control, sometimes is to end up to at least be able to authenticate some of those, different assets that are joining our network. And that's why, for example, the angle of availability, or rather asset monitoring, is very important. A CISO needs to know each and every 24/7 what are the different assets that are coming into my network, because now you have this angle where people are able to access, for example, their emails, or rather, for example, if you're using, for example, Microsoft, through OWA, you're able to access your email from the phone. Most people don't know that already is an attack vector, because when you log in your email, you can easily be compromised from your phone. And when you come back to the corporate network, I mean, hell, the guy has everything, because from your network, I'm able to do a transversal attack, for example, from the mail exchange server. I can go to AD. There are different attack vectors that I can be able to do. So I think the angle of BYOD, we have to ensure the CISO need to have a clear BYOD policy, and ensure that at least any device that comes to the network is quite clearly identified. Be it the MAC address, wherever, we must identify. So the asset registry, we might have a clear asset registry. We must assess what are the risks around that. We must have a clear policy. What exactly can somebody assess from those, bring your device that are coming to the corporate network? How do we assess that? I think it's very important, because at the end of the day, we understand it's going to be there, bring your own devices, but it's a risk that we have to manage very carefully, because it can be the only source of attack.
Absolutely, and I think that singular source of attack really is something, it's a risk mechanism and a risk matrix that every CISO needs to start thinking about. And already of course, is. And I really appreciate, Gilbert, that very methodological response that you've provided, especially with those use case examples. I really appreciate the way in which you contextualized it. We have 2 more minutes, and there's a pressing question that's come in, and I want to get both Vikas and Samuel's perspective on it before we come to a bit of a soft landing. And Vikas, we'll start with you, and this is very specific to the Africa context and the cloud, and that is around the lines of, have you seen scenarios where there are cross-country attacks happening in the cloud? And is that something that CISOs in Africa are particularly paying attention to? Vikas?
I think, Ali, respecting to the time, I will be very quick. I think if you look at the surge in the countries which are already present in most of those African countries also, there's obviously the propagation of threats are going cross borders.
Yep.
So what we see, the threat intelligence play a very key role in terms of how, as one country has been just seeing an attack, and how quickly you spontaneously alert to the other neighboring country. That's very important aspect. So I think those things are happening. Those things are real. And to answer you correctly, I think we need to be very smart to really be more proactive to understand. It's not about that if something is happening in Johannesburg, it's not going to affect Nairobi, or Nairobi doesn't affect Lagos. So I think there is a sort of information sharing of the threat intelligence is a very key aspect. And also from a point of industry, which industries are getting more sophisticated target attack, whether it's from a nation state or a group-based initiatives that are really focusing to bring a telco down or really bringing a bank down. So those are the key aspects, I say. Threat intelligence continuously monitoring.
I think that note about what's happening in Joburg also is shared with what's going on in Nairobi, points to a very secure sharing mechanism as well. Samuel, I'll give you the floor for a quick minute if you want to add to anything that Vikas had said, and then we'll conclude. Samuel?
All right, thank you so much, Ali. And aligning what Vikas said, I tell people that we all have a common enemy, right? The same guys that want to attack company A is the same guy that wants to attack company B, right? So the power of information sharing, threat intelligence, and collaboration cannot be overemphasized. So we need to do a lot of collaboration across industry, across countries. And I'll give you a typical example. I start in a SOC, in one of the big security operations centers in Africa, where I manage the security operations center team. We see a lot of attack coming from very certain countries, right? But I wouldn't want to mention names now, right? So we see all of those, and we have those kind of visibility. So what we do is to try to share that kind of information with other players in the industry so that it can be adequately protected, because you are strong as your weak link. And I know a lot of things that the regulators are doing. The regulators are also coming on board to ensure that there is some level of reporting from the industry experts, right? So the synergy is there, the collaboration is there, and that will go a long way in protecting the entire industry from that common enemy. So I'll close by saying, you are only as strong as your weakest link. Thank you.
Fantastic, and thank you so much for that. Vikas, Gilbert, Samuel, I'm going to ask you to stay on while I close this session so we can have a quick 20-second debrief, so don't drop off. But to our audience, what I will say is, A, thank you so much for your time and for joining and for your brilliant questions. You know, often here in North America, we talk a lot about rapid cloud adoption, and we talk about moving fast and moving quick. What you've heard today from these leaders from Africa is it's not just about rapid adoption, it's about responsible adoption. And you've heard me say this before, based on what you heard about the sharing economy and the sharing of intelligence, this is a great example of a community that is not just looking to go fast and go alone, they're looking to go far and go together. Responsible cloud adoption and responsible security go hand in hand. I'm going to thank our audience once again for giving us the time. There's a good break for another 90 minutes before we go into the next sessions. I want to thank our panelists for giving us their time, and I hope you enjoy yourself in the rest of the day's sessions here at the Intercontinental CISO Forum. Today's day brought to you by CyberX, Cyber Exchange, and the Africa Cyber Defense Forum. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you at the next session. Take care.
Thank you, guys.